Leland Congliani, and as he's coming up, I want to be able to give a brief introduction of Leland, who I feel like I know mostly from Zoom meetings, but there's been a couple times in person where I've gotten to meet him in Washington, D.C. Leland leads Louis Burke's energy practice, overseeing all Department of Energy issues, while also serving as co-chair of the Energy Sciences Coalition, which is how I've first met him. A little bit of that context: Louis Burke Associates is a government relations firm specializing in advocating for the public policy interests of institutions of higher education and other research and education organizations, ranging from the U.S. Executive Office and Congress to the State Department, think tanks, and the World Bank, and more. I got all of these examples from looking at the projects that his company works on. He then himself personally, though, with more than 15 years of experience advancing science and technology priorities for research institutions, Leland is a leading voice in the higher education and research advocacy community to advance basic and applied energy research and development programs, and he is also a frequent speaker at science and technology forums. Leland works closely with Congressional authorizing and appropriations committees and federal research agencies on behalf of academic institutions, scientific societies, and facility management organizations to create new research initiatives and programs, advance science infrastructure projects, and increase federal research funding. And then to that point, I mentioned he's the co-chair of the Energy Sciences Coalition. SSURF is a member of this coalition that includes dozens and dozens of science advocacy and research entities, and the ESC that Leland leads is a powerfully credible and influential and informed voice to both elected officials and other administration officials, expressing concerns and suggestions, and even, yes, at times kudos for the decisions that they are making relative to what affects particularly the Office of Science facilities here across the country. Prior to joining Louis Burke, Leland was the lead Senate Appropriations Committee staff member with budget and oversight responsibility for $17 billion in federal programs, including the DOE Office of Science, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, ARPA-E, and the National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA. So with that background perspective and all of the activity the ESC is involved in, we had asked Leland if he could give us an update on what may have happened, as I look at my watch, in the last 30 minutes, but really over the last several weeks in Congress, and the leadership atmosphere and the turmoil in some ways that is affecting the decision-making processes in Congress that we would otherwise be looking for. He's going to give us some perspective on that. I'll step away from the screen, but then come back for some more conversation with you, Leland. Thank you.
Yeah, so what I was asked for purposes of this discussion, really to talk a little bit about the funding outlook, as well as just what's happening in Congress and how this impacts all of you. So first, just a note on the Energy Sciences Coalition that Dan mentioned. I'm the co-chair along with Julie from Princeton University and Princeton Plasma Physics Lab. And so Energy Sciences Coalition has been around for more than 20 years. I've been leading it for the last 7 years. We have more than 110 member organizations, and I like to say it's the best deal in town since we are free and have no membership dues, but think we're pretty effective and impactful. We really are the lead advocacy arm for the DOE Office of Science, but as you see from the mission statement, it's a little bit broader. We do work a lot with ARPA-E, as well as the intersection in the translational science from the Office of Science to the applied energy programs. And then in terms of what this has to do with all of you, we talk a lot about the great work that the Office of Science does in terms of the research initiatives, as well as large-scale construction projects for world-class science facilities, as well as a lot of the workforce development. But the real competitive advantage and how DOE really distinguishes itself from other federal agencies are not just the network of DOE national labs, but the user facilities. And so we talk a lot about, it's actually now almost up to 38,000 users that use the various facilities. We focus more on the Office of Science, but obviously also have discussions about facilities managed by the Applied Energy Labs as well as NNSA, like the National Ignition Facility. And the little picture there is how we also engage with members of Congress that do not have a national lab or a large user facility in their state. I picked Indiana specifically because Senator Young was so instrumental in getting the CHIPS and Science Act passed into law. But how to make him a big proponent, not just of NSF, but also Department of Energy, is to show him all of the academic and some industry partners that use the user facilities and grow champions in that way as well. Next slide. And so then a little bit about Congress, right? In the summer, we were hopeful that there would be a path forward in terms of finalizing FY 2024 appropriations. And in particular, through the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it did create caps and pretty much flat funding for the next 2 fiscal years. But it was supposed to be the framework for the House, the Senate, Republicans, Democrats, the White House to negotiate final bills. But unfortunately, House Republicans, shortly after that was signed into law with actual bipartisan support, decided to mark up their bills below the funding caps. And it's what partially precipitated McCarthy losing his job and still uncertainty about what the fiscal outlook will look like and whether we're heading towards another government shutdown or not. Next slide. And so in terms of appropriations, and again, how it impacts all of you, the House and Senate did advance through the appropriations committees all 12 bills. So we know pretty much, if they can strike a final deal, where a lot of the numbers will fall for a lot of the key science agencies. And if you look at DOE Office of Science, halfway down that graphic there, while not great compared to prior years where we saw sometimes as much as 20% growth in one year, Office of Science fares better than some other agencies that have minus signs next to their funding outlooks. But the bigger problem here is not the outcome of any one agency or funding bill, but that the House and Senate are still $100 billion apart for non-defense discretionary spending, and that will impact how that shakes out and what that means for, say, operations funding or construction dollars for the Office of Science. Next slide. Then, of course, 2 hours before a shutdown on September 30th, Congress finally passed a continuing resolution to at least buy us 45 more days. And the key point on this long list for all of you, of course, was maintaining mostly flat funding at a fiscal year 2023 funding levels. DOE, again, and DOE and NNSA are fortunate that they're know-your funding agencies, and they can continue to use funding, even during a government shutdown, to pay for certain activities. So that mitigates some of the impact, but hopefully we will find a path forward. Next slide. The point of this is more that in addition to appropriation bills, there's a lot on congressional plate before the end of the year. There's the defense policy bill that they've actually signed into law for the last 62 years in a row. Let's hope they keep that trend. But beyond that, there were big bills that expired on September 30th that were temporarily extended, which include the Farm Bill, which come up every 5 years, the FAA reauthorization bill that comes up every 5 years. And then, of course, there's issues around border security. And that all is part of the discussions and negotiation space at the moment. And then you add Ukraine and Israel issues on top of that. So it just makes it a very complicated environment. Next slide. And then in terms of, again, just the projection of funding for your own planning, and both if you're a user as well as a facility operator, as you can see, there are some differences between the House and the Senate, but again, compared to a lot of funding agencies, the differences are relatively small, and ones that can be, a solution can be reached pretty easily. But we, ESC, are really fighting from the Office of Science side for the Senate mark, which you could see would be a 4% increase compared to FY 2023. And then seeing if there's an opportunity for supplemental funding on top of the regular appropriation bills. Can we get closer to the president's budget request of 8.8 billion, or even better, the CHIPS and Science, which was authorized funding level, which was closer to 9.5 billion. And a lot of that money actually would be to increase and fully support operations of facilities at optimal rates. Next slide. And then this is more just eye candy, but we track all of these issues very, very closely. And when we were providing recommendations, the CHIPS and Science Act, and specifically for the DOE provisions, it was a bottom-up exercise that included increase in core research funding, as well as increases for operational support of facilities and experiments. And the plan at the time was to increase those by 7% a year, research and operations at a minimum. That, of course, is not where we are yet in terms of actual funding, but it is something that CHIPS and Science did have bipartisan support, and it's what's needed to really outcompete other countries. And then all those words as just an example of what we included in our latest statement to Congress, specifically to our concern at the house mark level of the impacts to the operations of user facilities, and the drop in support for those activities. Next slide. And then lastly, and I'll open up for questions here, is we're fortunate that the appropriators on House Energy and Water, which fund Department of Energy activities and Office of Science activities, work well together. And so it also helps that some of them have national labs in their districts. So obviously with Congressman Fleischman, with Oak Ridge and Y12, and then of course, Ranking Member Capter has been strong supporter and champion for the Office of Science for a long time, even though she doesn't have a national lab in her state. And then of course, until recently, Senator Feinstein with many labs and user facilities in her state, and then more recently with Senator Kennedy. And of course, what we're all now with Senator Feinstein passing, who will take the helm and chair of Energy and Water. There's discussions about Senator Heinrich potentially filling in that role, if temporarily, if not until the new Congress. But who takes the helms is really, really important to our future, and engaged in those discussions as well. So I think that was my last slide. Next slide. Yep. So really look forward to, hopefully one, about you some time too, to any questions you might have based on the current environment.
Thank you very much, Leland. Those statistics, I know, at least for more policy and budget nerds, I really like seeing that kind of detail. Thank you for the effort to compile that and put it into context. I'll wait to see if we might get a couple questions here in our chat. Could I ask you your sense of whether the political winds seem to be moving towards what would be a version of an omnibus, or if the statements in the past by many of the congresspersons has been that that's not a process that they're wanting to endorse? It seems like that is a concern that's driving some of the turmoil right now in terms of electing a new leader. But what do you perceive as maybe being the way to getting a next fiscal year budget approved?
Sure, yeah. So I think step one is to have a budget framework. So right now, both the White House and House Republican and Democratic senators have said they're not renegotiating the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So a lot will depend on who the next House Speaker is and whether they abide by the actual law, which set the caps for 24 and 25. So assuming you can agree to those caps, it's pretty much flat funding. Then next step is, how do you package this to get it to that finish line? It's been clear, House Republicans have been clear they do not want to pass an omnibus package, which is all 12 bills together in one massive package. So the path forward is what they were trying to do in both the House and the Senate, which is mini buses. Mini buses are pretty much 3 bills at a time. It is still a bit consolidated, but much more manageable. And so if you take 3 at a time until you finish all 12, then you can schedule those, over 2 months, have an open amendment process, and then conference between the House and the Senate. You can even skip floor debate on the House and Senate, since they technically have all 12 bills, and more just move, kind of negotiate 3 at a time, get everything resolved, and then pass them. And I think the incentive here to get it done, right, are 2 things. One, they built in a mechanism in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that actually it triggers on January 1st and doesn't go into full effect until April 31st, but a 1% across the board cut for defense and non-defense. So if you're at a full year CR, you're going to cut defense and non-defense spending by 1% based on FY23 spending levels. Addition to that, the defense hawks are worried because the Fiscal Responsibility Act actually provided $26 billion more in funding for defense activities, for national security activities. If you have a full year CR, that $26 billion disappears and is no longer on the table, and you take a 1% cut. So I think that's what's driving a lot of the interest in negotiating a package. And then there's 2 political reasons. One, you usually have a full year CR during a presidential election year. So this might be the last bill we get. And 2025 has no new funding anyway, so it doesn't matter. Second is that this is really the first time that House Republicans in their majority can shape the appropriation bills. If you pass a CR, technically you're locking in the policies of a Democratic administration and Congress that negotiated the final package in 2023. So hopefully why I'm optimistic, all those reasons that we will eventually get some kind of final 2024 appropriations package for all the agencies we care about.
Okay, thank you. I like that rationale to perhaps be a bit hopeful as we watch the soap opera continue there. But all right, well, thank you. Actually, we're right up to time, and I appreciate those slides and also being able to provide the insight into the Energy Sciences Coalition. If that group and what Leland was describing is of interest to you, please seek him out, or you can reach me and I can connect you in there as well. SSURF has found it very valuable to be part of the conversations that Leland and his team arrange for that whole network of organizations interested in particularly what kind of issues are affecting and can shape opportunities for Office of Science facilities. All right. Thanks again, Leland.